Ayanokoji Kiyotaka vs. Light Yagami. Could he solve the Kira case? The Kira case is one of the most notorious cases in fiction, with its incredible difficulty and scope. Light Yagami, aka Kira, someone who was so great that it took the world's greatest detective, Lawliet, to challenge him. An unknown serial killer, with no one knowing how to find him. Could Ayanokoji solve it? Well, first let's see why Ayanokoji would be solving something like the Kira case in the first place. In this hypothetical scenario, the White Room exists in the Death Note universe, which would eventually attract the attention of Wami's house due to insiders in metropolitan Japan. Wami's house is interested in the White Room's existence, especially their top prospect, as both institutions possess differing philosophies and training methods. For the sake of the video, the White Room and Wami house make a deal to compare their top two prospects, Lawliet and Kiyotaka Ayanokoji. L and Ayanokoji meet under the jurisdiction of the White Room and Wami House in Winchester, England, and it turns out that L is interested in Ayanokoji's capabilities and decides to test him. Since the prospect of a successor is still up in the air, it is proposed that for a decent amount of time, Ayanokoji will act as L and solve crimes, so that both can be evaluated as detectives. L, because he's bored and wants to see just how capable Ayanokoji is, was the one who pitched the idea. Wami's house and the White Room do not see much of an issue with this arrangement. And since being a world-class detective means a lot of new experiences, Ayanokoji accepts this breath of fresh air. Ayanokoji, before he assumes the temporary mantle of L, will explore, talk to others, and acclimate to the world before he is assigned cases to work on. Soon enough, he adapts to it, and he's ready for his first case. Recently, several random heart attacks have occurred within Japan at an exponential rate, killing only criminals broadcasted by the news. People of the world have begun to call this phenomenon the work of Kira, an anonymous figure bringing judgment onto the wicked, and thus, Ayanokoji's first task will begin: catch Kira and bring the serial killer to justice. As stated before in the scenario, Ayanokoji will be treated as L, and thus have all the resources and potential connections L had in the series. Naturally, Light Yagami will continue to have the Death Note, and thus act as Kira. This will shape a cat and mouse situation, where the first to eliminate the other wins. First, we need to establish a few things. Despite not having any experience initially due to staying in the White Room for the majority of his life, Ayanokoji possesses exceptional ability as a detective. For instance, back during the first island exam in year 1, Ayanokoji was able to deduce and break down Ryuen's entire strategy and deal allying with Class A just by observing that Ibiki had dirt under her fingernails, allowing him to draw multiple inferences about her being a spy for Class C and Ryuen sending her after Class D. This allowed him to swiftly counterattack Class C and Class A with the implementation of his exam-winning strategy in a blink of an eye. We also see Ayanokoji subsequently being able to deduce that Ryuen and Kanzaki made a deal during the Zodiac exam in Year 1, Volume 4, by observing the movements of points in the classes during the entirety of the exam, which allowed him to further deduce and anticipate their strategies for the future through his precise observations throughout the exam. Deductions like this were crucial in misdirecting and leading Ryuen throughout the X-Arc, resulting in the famous confrontation between the two of them in Year 1, Volume 7. Skipping a little bit forward, another instance where we see his immense detective skills is in Year 2, when we see Kazumi Hosen brandishing a knife towards him after beating up Pseudo in Horikita. Right now, Hosen has just declared that he would stab and kill Ayanokoji if Horikita didn't fork up 2 million private points. To conclude their negotiations, the situation is getting out of hand and Hosen is winding up to stab him. But Ayanokoji doesn't falter in that instant. He merely observed that the knife Hosen is holding is a kitchen knife, and thus deduces that Hosen is planning to stab himself with the knife to frame it on him. So he doesn't let Hosen do that, and instead lets Hosen stab him with the knife, forcing a blood-stained contract where Hosen is forced to partner up with Ayanokoji for the partner exam, if he doesn't want to get expelled. He also deduced that Ichika was the person who tried to set him up in this scenario, also figuring out with his key observations that Ichika and Hosen teamed up to potentially expel him in Hosen's case and test him in Ichika's case. This led him to make strong inferences about the possibility that Ichika was one of the secret White Room students well before they confronted him directly in the second island exam. It's clear that Ayanokoji is extremely observant and possesses an insane amount of fluid reasoning and detective abilities that's not much of a laughing matter. If you're enjoying this video so far, please subscribe so I can hit 20k subscribers very soon, pretty please. Ayanokoji attends the Interpol International Police meeting when criminals around the world start dying of heart attacks, as Interpol canonically calls in assistance from L to solve the case. In this scenario, however, Ayanokoji would remain hidden to maintain the secretive nature of L, but instead of Watari coming in to speak his name, it would be someone else. Tokunari Tsukishiro. Atsuomi Ayanokoji had assigned Tsukishiro to monitor and function as Ayanokoji's bodyguard for the duration of his stint as L. Think of Tsukishiro like Ayanokoji's Watari, if you must. While Atsuomi's influence is great in Japan, it is not strong internationally. So to keep tabs on his son, Atsuomi requests his trusted ally to help him. With that, Tsukishiro agreed to this with his usual old man smile, but he does admit that he sees this as nothing more than babysitting. Moving back to the present, Ayanokoji agrees to help solve the case during the Interpol meeting and suggests that he may need cooperation if necessary. But he also makes it clear that if the case proves to be truly unsolvable, well, it's out of his hands. With that being said, Ayanokoji will start meticulously analysing the pattern of heart attacks attributed to Kira. As of the past weeks, there have been 52 victims, with all of them having been broadcasted to the television as criminals, and were either pursued by the police or caught behind bars. He would also gather data on the victims, the circumstances surrounding their deaths, and any commonalities that could provide clues to Kira's identity. His ability to deduce intricate details from seemingly unrelated information would be a key asset in this phase, which would lead Ayanokoji to a few beginning inferences. Kira can kill people by inducing heart attacks in them. Whether he's doing this through closer range means has yet to be confirmed. Kira is someone who strives to only kill convicted criminals, which likely means that he has a strong sense of justice or feels as though he must kill them. Kira has only been killing people that have been broadcasted by the media. If he had only killed 5 people, then I would have chalked this down to simple coincidence. But all 52 of his victims have been broadcasted by the media. If he wanted to be more efficient, he'd simply kill people based on their names in file books, but he isn't doing that. This leads me to believe that Kira doesn't have confidential information on criminals. He's relying on media coverage for his information. Kira is most likely a citizen who doesn't currently have access to confidential records. Kuro Otahara is a rather suspicious victim. His death was an unexpected heart attack that occurred just before the killings began. Since the death was only reported in the Japanese media coverage, it is possible that Kira may be a citizen of Japan. Not only that, but it would also stand to reason that Kira hasn't been killing for very long if Otahara functioned as a test of some sorts. Additionally, the name Kira in Japanese for killer is pretty obvious that his fanbase lies in Japan, so he should likely as well. The times of death for most of these victims are during out-of-school hours. It's not definite, but there may be a strong possibility that Kira is a student. This would be Ayanokoji's thought process when trying to understand Light's initial movements. Ultimately, the most he can infer is that Kira is a person who hasn't been killing for very long, and is most likely a Japanese citizen. That narrows it down quite a bit, but it would still prove to be quite a challenge to decipher anything else. Canonically, L took a shot in the dark to use Lindell Taylor as bait to get Light to kill him to inadvertently reveal information about his location and mentality on public television. L took a risk and it ended spectacularly. However, Ayanokoji does not act like this, as stated in the conversation with Tsukishiro in Year 1. He prefers to account for every possibility he can perceive before engaging and making strategies. This essentially means that Ayanokoji will wait and act defensively until he sees or can create an opportunity with a very high success rate before engaging. He does not like to take big risks, as his sense of self-preservation and risk assessment is extremely potent. This translates into how meticulous he is, as he is shown to go as far as tasting paper to see that a letter that is integral to his strategy is durable enough to sustain a message. L and Ayanokoji are similar in how manipulative they are. This isn't talked about a lot, but L is rather manipulative, perhaps even a sociopath. Throughout the series, he is shown to be willing to resort to extreme measures, such as harm and destroying lives, just to win a case. In various scenes, he convincingly feigns emotions, even during moments of crisis when everyone else is in distress. Notably, L is consistently depicted without sweat marks on his face in the manga, indicating a deliberate choice by Obata to convey that he is generally not surprised or concerned. The only time he is during one point of the manga is where Light made him follow a red herring. Ayanokoji has a very similar temperament to L, as it should be clear to any reader of Classroom Elite that Ayanokoji is more willing to use Dark Triad and completely abhorrent methods to advance his goals. His manipulation of characters like K is more than enough to prove this. The reason why I'm explaining this similarity in the Dark Triad traits between the two right now is to make it more understandable when Ayanokoji uses less moral methods to catch Light, even more than L, especially because Ayanokoji does not possess much of an ego when it comes to those outside the White Room. He's very Machiavellian-esque. Lastly, it's highly doubtful whether Ayanokoji would formally organize a task force similar to how L did in canon, because Ayanokoji simply does not operate in that way. If he needs assistance, he would just ask, but he would never create a team built to take down Kira. If worst comes to worst, he would try to indirectly manipulate law enforcement groups with his influence as L to do certain things without them realizing it. Ayanokoji typically works as a lone wolf, so any chance to form a group would only be on the table if he exhausted all of his methods. Without further ado, Ayanokoji would shortly begin to develop a strategy to gain more information on Kira, his ability to kill others through heart attacks and specific personality flaws he can exploit. Ayanokoji would set up a series of controlled experiments to test the limits of Kira's abilities. Requesting assistance from the MPA, he would discreetly tip false information about potential criminal targets to the Japanese media, carefully monitoring any subsequent heart attacks to see if Kira had killed anyone. However, here's the catch: the faces of each person are switched around, except one criminal who is on death row. This is for a variety of reasons. If Kira has access to confidential information about criminals, then the switching of face shouldn't matter, as he should have the names and faces based on the criminal databases. If he truly does rely on media coverage, though, this should tell Ayanokoji how Kira's abilities to kill people works. Does he need to kill them on sight? Does he need to see their correct faces first? Does he need their correct names? Having a control group, this being the criminal on death row with nothing strange about him happening, can allow Ayanokoji to compare the results. A few days pass as the strategy unfolds. Ayanokoji observes the reactions and patterns in the heart attack that follow as Kira falls for the trap. It turns out that the only criminal on death row has reported to have a heart attack, while every other criminal is doing completely fine. This allows Ayanokoji to make more deductions. Kira relies exclusively on media coverage to perform his killings. Kira's ability to kill people through heart attacks isn't absolute. He needs to have exact information on them to work, meaning if you switch the faces or names of people, his ability will not work. Feeling content with the information he has gathered, Ayanokoji decides to head back to Japan and continue the casework there. Seeing that Kira is confirmed to be in Japan, and he can begin to narrow down and gather more evidence about him, he continues leaking false information and sometimes leaving correct information at sporadic instances. He doesn't want Kira to start killing innocents if he effectively sends false information at all times pragmatically. Ayanokoji would be more fine with Kira killing criminals instead of innocents if he must kill something. Also, this leaking of false information and sometimes leaving correct information is something similar to Volume 3 Ayanokoji Island exam strategies. At the same time, Light would be confused that only one of the criminals he wrote the name of in the death note is dead, but not all the others. Light's ego is heavily intertwined with his power to dispense justice through the death note. Being unable to eliminate criminals as desired would enrage and confuse him greatly. Upon realizing the anomalous failures, Light would initially suspect the integrity of the Death Note itself. Perhaps there were undocumented rules he was unaware of, or abnormalities with the supernatural killing powers it channels. Meticulously cross-referencing with variations in names and photos, Light would ultimately rule out internal issues with the note itself. When subjects with unaltered identities still die as expected, this points to an external inference. Someone is manipulating what information reaches him. Ayanokoji would anticipate that Light/Kira would reach that conclusion, but unlike L in canon, he hasn't revealed himself yet, meaning that Light has no leads to go on for who would possibly be feeding false information to the media. On top of this, there is a second trap in Ayanokoji's strategy. Suppose that Kira reduces the frequency or even momentarily stops killing in fear that the media would have falsified information on criminals. Light will essentially have to admit to Ayanokoji that he relies specifically on media resources to gather information, which adds more evidence to Ayanokoji's induction that Kira is most likely a student without much access to government classified resources. Light realizes that this person, most likely a detective or even some federal bureau with a considerable amount of influence, has pushed him to a corner, and knowing who Light is, he cannot back down. Therefore, Light uses his father, Light Yagami, as a means to gather information on classified criminals. Hacking into his father's computer without leaving a trace, he can use the names of recently convicted criminals in Japan to resume his killings. Note that the information about L/Ayanokoji is still hidden, and thus wouldn't show up on the database as it did canonically. Considering that Ayanokoji's return to Japan was covert and not directly aligning himself with the MPA yet, has concealed his identity. Ayanokoji notices the resurgence of killings that were recently convicted criminals not yet publicized. He deduces Kira must have covert access to police data, somehow despite the earlier profile he made on him. This is odd. Is Kira someone who has access to confidential police records? But that doesn't make sense. If they had access to that all along, why would they fall for my earlier trap? Why would they go through the hassle of listening into the media if he had free access to all of his private information beforehand? This doesn't make sense. No. Wait a minute. If Kira, yes, this could work. Is Kira the child or benefactor who has ties to the police or law enforcement? If that's the case, does Kira have an accomplice, knowingly or unknowingly? This would lead Ayanokoji's thought process. Essentially, Ayanokoji would need to gather evidence on whether Kira is a student, and whether and though what means too they have access to law enforcement intelligence. There is no doubt that Ayanokoji would start by spending his next few days searching through high schools and universities, starting with the Kanto region first, as it has the highest population. He forgoes middle schools because he acknowledges that Kira's structured killings are the work of someone who is intelligent, and despite having a black and white view of the world, must have at least some level of higher level knowledge that a middle school student could typically have. Having deduced Kira likely has access to police systems, Ayanokoji begins discreetly investigating relatives of key MPA personnel. He starts by leaking falsified records of non-publicized criminals in the MPA database, tagging each entry with unique identifiers. As expected, a portion of them die soon after, meaning Kira or an ally has database access. Cross-referencing the classified data access logs, Ayanokoji noticed a pattern of activity from completely different accounts. Ayanokoji immediately realizes that Kira had succeeded in misdirecting him. Light, knowing that whoever is trying to stop him can likely reverse engineer his logs back to his dad's account. And he was able to predict Ayanokoji's movements to an extent by buying a VPN just for this occasion. The VPN's access would be to conceal the fact that he's using Yuuichi Yagami's account repeatedly, and instead would constantly change the logs to make it seem as though the IP address and accounts are completely random. Ayanokoji/L acknowledges that Light played a great move here. He has to step up his game. Having been misdirected by Light's VPN trickery, Ayanokoji acknowledges his opponent's rather cunning wit. Rather than brute force checking logs, he analyzes the killings for deeper patterns. He notes that despite the IP obfuscation consistently occur in Japanese time zones, spiking during after-school hours as usual. This fits the student profile, closely monitoring justice disbursements, directly challenging law enforcement. Additionally, killed criminals match case files only available domestically. Foreign incidents, reported solely in international news, failed to elicit a response even when meeting Light's ideals. This localizes the killings to Japan and most likely the Kanto region, regardless of IP spoofing. He cannot trace the location yet, but he can confirm one consistent database infiltrator. These observable patterns triangulate the leak to a Japanese student deeply connected to the MPA records. At the time this occurs, Ayanokoji would have finished making his profiling of every single student in Kanto high schools and universities. This may be improbable for some characters, but it's important to understand how utterly insane Ayanokoji's memory is. For lack of a better word, his memory is pretty much perfect, as he can instantly memorize strings of digits, words, and codes, and especially mention in Volume 0 just how impressive and malleable his memory capacity is. I'll go over his memory in a video soon, so you can understand the exact perfect part of it. What I'm getting at now is that the noose is tying more and more around Light's neck. Having narrowed down the suspect pool to Japanese high school students with connections to the MPA, Ayanokoji predicts that the person who is likely a candidate to be Kira due to his previous profiling of him must be Light Yagami, the son of Yuuichi Yagami. Due to his profiling of high schools throughout the Kanto region, Light stood out due to his high test score and grades that are consistently at the top of the entire nation. This perfectly fits the bill for Kira, as Ayanokoji has previously observed that Kira is a very intelligent person who has a strict and meticulous killing schedule, which is the exact type of behavior an overperforming honor student would have. Having narrowed down his suspect to Light Yagami, remember it's just a suspect, it's not confirmed, Ayanokoji now knows that he has to tread carefully. While the evidence circumstantially points to Light Yagami, he has no concrete proof. He decides to manipulate Light's daily life, adding certain impediments that would allow him to gather information on how Light deals with adversity, and whether he can truly conclude that Light is Kira without it being a misdirection from some other higher figure that maybe just be using this kid Light, and Kira is someone else, so he has to make sure that it's not a misdirection. To test Light's true personality, Ayanokoji hacks the testing scores database at Light's high school. He reduces Light's perfect grades by a few critical points on an important upcoming exam that is integral for his preparations for the entrance of Toho University, one of the most prestigious universities in Japan. One of the hardest to get into, too, that Ayanokoji has no doubt an honor student like Light would be slaving away at. Light finishes the test confident, as always, only to find a 95% test score instead of his standard 100% upon receiving the results. The tiny blow to his ego is enough to set Light off as he confronts staff about potential grading errors. Staff find nothing wrong, provoking fury in Light, although he hides it behind a pleasant guise. To gather information on this situation, Ayanokoji requests Tsukishiro to enter the high school at that time under the guise of an esteemed guest, the falsification of Tsukishiro's identity being dealt with by Atsuomi's sources. Ayanokoji doesn't want to directly request assistance from the MPA just yet. As a chief police officer, Yuuichi Yagami will be informed that his son is currently under suspicion by L for being Kira. He simply cannot risk in this critical phase that Yuuichi would blabber about this to his son. Anyway, Tsukishiro covertly records and Anyway, Tsukishiro covertly records and watches Light's reaction so he can give it to Ayanokoji for critical analysis. He is an assassin after all. Ayanokoji receives this information and tells Tsukishiro to stalk Light until he reaches his school, house, and cram school for the next 3 days. Feeling that the video is only more proof that Light's behavior has certain defects he can exploit. Not only that, but this can also provide evidence on how Light is killing people and where he conducts his killings after school. Tsukishiro begins following Light after school for the next 3 days wearing a concealed black outfit that won't give any indication of who he is, utilizing his stealth skills to stalk him expertly. Light doesn't notice this until Ryuk tells him that someone has been following him for the past few hours. Unable to stomach the feeling of someone watching him despite Tsukishiro not being able to see Ryuk. It's literally just the same as Ray Pemba, but yeah. As Light hears about the unseen stalker, paranoia sets in. He realizes Kira's identity may be close to exposure. Desperate for information, Light decides to go back on what he said before about not killing innocents. He concludes that some people must be sacrificed for justice. He uses the Death Note to manipulate a cybersecurity agent into secretly tracking the surveillance efforts and any possibility of a data breach in his school, emailing his conclusions to Light before collapsing of a heart attack. The agent discovers the intricate falsified criminal records and school database tampering, all originating from a server in Tokyo, Japan, the same city that Light lives in. The agent also notes that the person had a VPN installed on their device, so he was able to mine the server, but not the IP address. Someone wants to catch me? Not only that, but they live in the same city as me. Was it the stalker? Damn it. I have to figure it out now. Light's internal monologue would be saying this. Tsukishiro returned after his job was finished, explaining that Light did not do anything out of the usual, but he did pick up on the fact that Light's movements felt robotic and too fluid, almost as if he was thinking about how he would act, like he knew someone was watching him. Koji internally questions Tsukishiro's abilities as an assassin, but he knows Tsukishiro has killed many people without them noticing his presence, and Tsukishiro knows how to conceal his sense of self. This is odd, unless Light was trained similarly to him, or on the off chance that his perception skills are superhuman. There will be no way for him to be acting so robotically as Tsukishiro noted. Tsukishiro also notes that before the second day he acted normally, and didn't do anything besides go to school, go to cram school, and go home. It was only the second day onwards that Light began to act slightly more robotically. This has only increased Ayanokoji's suspicion of Light. Does Kira kill in his bedroom? Ayanokoji senses the climax. Having gathered enough evidence on Light to convince himself, Ayanokoji feels that Light is most likely a suspect of Kira. But he knows that he can't spell his victory unless he can show irrefutable evidence that Light is Kira. To prove that Light kills in his room, he decides to set up a series of controlled experiments. Having gathered more information on the Yagami household, Ayanokoji finds that Suichiro Yagami, the chief police officer of the MPA, works on average 12-hour shifts at the office, usually leaving before Light goes to school, and sometimes returns after he comes back home. Ayanokoji notes that this is the perfect time to set up an experiment, as Light won't be under the surveillance of his father. Ayanokoji sets up a complex experiment where he can control the environment around Light. To set the stage, he hacks into the internet service provider of the Yagami household and makes sure that they are scheduled to have their internet temporarily disconnected for the next couple days. This aligns out the time when Suichiro would be out of town to deal with the case. He also makes sure that he can temporarily manipulate the electricity of the Yagami household. In other words, he can turn the power on and off for a specific duration. He also ensures that the power outages will occur while Suichiro is out of his house, when Light is home. He finally ensures that Light's bedroom has an air conditioner, which he can use to cool or warm the room to specific temperatures. The goal of this experiment is to test whether Light can kill people while the power is turned off in his room. Ayanokoji understands that Kira, despite killing people through heart attacks, has consistently needed to tap into media or online information to be able to write the names of the criminals down, and Ayanokoji is determined to see whether Light kill people when the power is turned off. If Light is truly Kira, he would have to somehow be killing people when the power is off. There's no way that Light is using candles to kill people, as there is no way he would have enough time to get all the names down with candles. Ayanokoji understands that the power will go out in Light's room for 30 minutes in intervals. This means that Light will have 30 minutes to kill someone, and then the power will go off for the next 30 minutes. Once it turns back on, Ayanokoji will see if anyone has died of a heart attack. Ayanokoji decides that he will turn the power off and on for 4 times to test this out. This means that Light has 3 hours and 30 minutes to kill people. Ayanokoji makes sure that he controls the temperature of Light's room to be 15 degrees Celsius, so that he knows that Light will be chilly but not too cold, and won't try to turn on a computer to heat up the room. Ayanokoji understands that Light will have to write the names of criminals in this time. This means that he will have to use something like a notepad and a pen to write down the names of criminals. Ayanokoji assumes that Light has access to a notepad and pen, considering he's an honor student. He was taking cram school and most likely takes notes at school. Ayanokoji also understands that he needs to manipulate the media to leak the names of criminals, as this is the only way for Light to kill them. Ayanokoji waits for the time to come. He hacks into the internet service provider of the Yagami household and turns the internet off for the next 30 minutes. He then hacks into the electricity company of the Yagami household and turns off the power for the next 30 minutes. After this, he turns on the air conditioner and Light's room to the temperature of 15 degrees Celsius, making sure that Light is home. He then leaks the names of criminals to Japanese media and waits. After 30 minutes, the power comes back on in Light's room, and Ayanokoji turns off the air conditioning and turns off the internet. He will continually do this for 4 times so that he can test out the limits of Light's abilities. Heart attacks are reported. Light is Kira. Later on, Ayanokoji pulls some strings with his influence to arrange a private chat with Light alone, under the pretense of a special scholarship opportunity sponsored by the prestigious Whammy House and L, the greatest detective in the world, who is Ayanokoji. Ayanokoji manipulates Light to arrive alone in an empty classroom at the high school after hours, pretending to have left behind important paperwork. The doors and windows are sealed shut by Ayanokoji beforehand, preventing Light from having any access to things like the news and media at this moment. Once alone, Ayanokoji subtly drops references to falsified criminal deaths, grade hacking, forcible power outages, and the stalking that he made Tsukishiro do. Throughout the natural conversation, Light plays innocently initially, but shows micro-reactions confirming his recognition of those events. Light is an excellent actor, but there is an extent to which he can act as perfectly as possible. Consider that the person standing in front of him is what has been making his job so difficult for the past couple weeks, and there is no doubt that Light would be struggling to keep calm as Kira. He is too prideful and egotistic to not be feeling the rage boiling in him. Ayanokoji knows this and wants to provoke these feelings out even further. And the only way to do this is through making Light feel cornered, as he is the one who is putting a stop to Kira's killing spree. Despite this, Light just acts innocent. Ayanokoji has prepared for this. He pulls out a printed paper. This is the sent email of the man Light killed to reverse engineer Ayanokoji's location. It turned out that the man was an MPA cybersecurity officer. So when it turns out that he died of a heart attack, he was immediately investigated, including his sent messages. One of the sent messages was to Light's email. This was only discovered last night, and it turned out the cybersecurity agent sent his final message to Light before a heart attack, telling Light that someone was targeting him as well as the server they were on. This information was found through reverse engineering Light's IP address, the email that was sent, and the message in Light's inbox. This could have all been prevented temporarily had Light made a spare email address, but being so panicked due to Tsukishiro stalking him, that made him ignore such a flaw in his tactic to find out Ayanokoji's relative location. There was no way to sidestep this damning evidence, and this conversation was only more proof to the MPA, who was currently listening into the conversation since the classroom was bugged and knew that Light was digging a hole for himself. Light Yagami, you are Kira. Light snaps. Light's expression morphs from a gentle smile to a sinister grin. He monologues about being the god of the new world, similar to how he did in the final episode, admitting openly to being Kira and using the Death Note to dispense justice. He pulls out a scrap of the Death Note's paper from his watch, pricking his finger with a needle to write his name on the Death Note, but he realizes something at the last moment. He didn't know the name of the man standing before him. Light breaks down, unable to cope with the reality that he's seriously going to lose. He even begs Ryuk to write Ayanokoji's name in the notebook, but Ryuk says nothing. Ayanokoji walks off, sealing the door shut as the MPA begins to raid the school, leaving Light to cope with his loss.
You're extremely cunning and intelligent, Light Yagami, but you slipped, and as much as you tried to cover your tracks, it eventually went downhill for you. Your ego is your weakness, as it is with many other criminals like you. This wasn't a game. It was simply your execution.
After Light is arrested, the media reports that he dies of a heart attack. So yeah, Ayanokoji ends up victorious for the Kira case, while he was able to complete what L could not, and not even doing the same things as L. But there is 2 big reasons why Ayanokoji would be able to complete the case quicker and successfully. Ayanokoji does not have an ego like L. He wouldn't directly confront Light until he is sure it would be the climax, not the beginning of a conflict, L wanted a battle of wits between an individual who appeared to be like-minded in intelligence, which led L to perform actions that could be considered suboptimal and risky, when he normally wouldn't do that. Essentially, L reveled in the game. Ayanokoji just saw this as a case that he needed to complete for his task. Light wouldn't have the time to properly develop a scheme and become more experienced with the Death Note. Ayanokoji is facing a beginning of the series Light, who he wouldn't try to entertain unlike L did. This is the same Light who fell for L's provocations through the Lindell Taylor trap, and continued to leave more and more clues for L in the beginning for the sake of his pride. The biggest example being when he questioned legitimacy of the police, and L when the topic of the FBI agents moving to Japan for the Kira case arose in the Yagami household. Instead of acting normally, Light, due to immense pride, called out L and only created more suspicion for himself, just to enhance the game. Decision making like this is something that would just make it easier for Ayanokoji to convict Light. Light improves and becomes more competent later on, but he wouldn't have the time to properly adapt in this scenario. This video isn't to say Ayanokoji is more intelligent or smarter than L, but it's to highlight their differences and how they would approach certain scenarios.